Hello and welcome back to the Art of Parenting. This is your host, Jeanne-Marie, and today I have Lindsey Cormack, and we're going to talk about how to raise citizens. I wanted to put good citizens, but it's raise citizens, right? No judgment. And so, Lindsey, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us on the Art of Parenting today. A big welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Yes. So I always like to start with having my guests define what the art of parenting means to them.
Sure. So the way I sort of think about it is that there's components of nurture, there's components of guiding, and there's components of support. And we all know we have different kids. And the way that I think about it in my context is trying to do a little bit better than our parents did for us. So that way our kids can grow up into a politics that feels a little bit better and functions a little bit better by modeling behaviors for them and teaching them how to communicate and telling them about our systems.
Yes, so important. And I love that you put doing it better than our parents, because I'm a firm believer that parenting is like an evolution where we're parenting differently than the way we were parented. Our children will parent differently, and we're always evolving and we're always learning new things anyways about parenting, about the brain, about our children, and so forth. So thank you for that. So I would love if we could start with just having you introduce yourself to our listeners, our viewers, a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing today.
Sure. So I'm an associate professor at Stevens Institute of Technology. I've been working as a professor for 10 years. And the way that I got there is sort of roundabout. I grew up in Kansas. I went to the University of Kansas for my undergrad. I spent a year in DC, and then I ended up at NYU in New York City for my graduate degree. And something I really like about sort of studying politics is that seeing politics in Kansas versus seeing politics in New York City are just so very different. And I've had almost equal time in both now at my age. And it's just really led me to think about we're all trying to do our best. We have different constraints. And the reason that I got into this work is because I work with college students. And I think college students are some of the best people to work with because they're hopeful, they're bright, they're full of life. But what I kept finding is that even with my students who are very good at doing school, who are very intelligent, oftentimes they're underprepared to engage in politics. And that felt like a shame. It felt like something that was unfair. And so that's how I got into researching what we can do to better prepare our kids to be citizens.
And when you say citizens, because I just heard when you were talking about the college students about being involved in politics, does that mean necessarily wanting to, be in politics, or just being aware of the political language and so forth?
So here's what I say at the beginning of all my classes and then at the end of the semester. I tell them politics is going to happen to us whether we like it or not. So it's better if we at least understand the process. Because truly, whether you want to participate, whether you want to vote, you want to run for office, you want to help on campaigns, that doesn't much matter. You are a part of politics. Your body is counted in the census. Goods and monies are distributed based on who lives where. And so it's better if we sort of understand the game we're playing versus just going at it lost.
Yes, yes, very, very interesting. And so you work with college students, but if we were to ask, like, what is a good time in a child's life to introduce politics, in our home, because they witness us talking politics. I know I have, I'm part French, part American, and in France, we're raised to talk politics from a very, very young age. And just I think to me, I would have to say there's a lot more education about being critical thinkers in France, or at least the way that I've kind of compared the two. But here, how soon do you start involving children in what's going on in politics?
So I think the thing is we don't really make that choice. The world makes that choice for us. They are involved. They
They
hear
are.
things even when they're little, right? They're little sponges. They're trying to make sense of their world. And so in the book, I sort of break it down for what do you do for very young children? Then what do you do for adolescents? And then what do you do for teenagers? And for very young children, I have two sorts of big points. One is we have to be willing to let them see this. We have to be willing to have conversations in front of them and conversations with them. Because a lot of parents, especially in the United States, especially in the middle parts of the country, were raised thinking that these topics are off limits. Like there may be impolite or they offend someone. And that sort of hesitancy to talk about politics is problematic. Like if we don't know how to talk about these things, we can't fix these things. So the first point that I always make is be willing to do it. And then the second point that I make for people who have really young children is to make sure that it's not only the negative aspects of politics. And I understand we all have frustrations and pain points, but if all they see is us saying, politicians are liars and cheats and they're egomaniacs and it's a dirty industry, it's not surprising that they don't want to go learn more. It's something that they want to avoid. And our children get enough anti-politics messages that we don't need to bring it. Like take, for instance, some of our TV shows for kids or literature for kids. Oftentimes, the government official is something like a mayor. And at best, they're sort of like a bumbling doofus. And at worst, they're out to do ill to their city. And so they're getting these messages. And we have to do the work of saying, like, actually, there are things that governments do that are supportive of us. If we have good roads, if we have good schools, if we have clean water, that's usually government that's at play somewhere in a positive way.
Right, right. And that's so true. And I feel that's even truer today, where I feel, unfortunately, politics has become very divisive and kind of, I see it. I mean, I see it around just my community where, you were talking about not talking about politics in front of children. I've noticed now at social events, politics is off the table. Like we don't bring things up because it's become so decisive, which is unfortunate because, again, I'll say my background is like talking politics is a sport. Like it's, you want to be able to understand the other side, kind of talk about it. And unfortunately, I feel that we've become very like, if you don't believe what I believe in, then I don't want to hear it. And that's unfortunate. So saying all of that, how would you encourage families to make sure that we are raising citizens who are willing to listen to both sides and willing to work with each other?
So I think something that's really important is to recognize that politics is not just what happens at the federal level. A lot of
Yes.
times we get obsessed with like right now, the presidential election. Anytime it's a presidential election year, that's what everyone talks about. It's two people competing, when in reality there's thousands of elections going on. And so part of the things that I talk about in this book is that our kids really need to know that politics is everywhere. Local politics are just people, your neighbors, people who work in your schools, who are trying to do the best they can. And I think when you sort of personalize it and you say, these are people, and you let them see the people who are doing that activity, then it's a lot harder to just be like mad at this amorphous government something or these politicians who are far off in a distant land making choices. And it's also true. Like a lot of our decisions happen close to home and we just don't see them. So I think that that's like the first piece, is making sure we humanize this versus what we hear in sort of the media. And the second piece is I think we need to stop this narrative that everyone who disagrees with us is either an idiot or evil. Because a lot of times everyone just has a different version of what the good life is and how to get there. And I talk to a lot of local politicians and a lot of state politicians and a number of federal politicians. And I've never met anyone who's out there saying like, you know what, I'm just going to do this to hurt you. It's usually I'm doing this because I think this is better for a community that I care about. Sometimes that comes at the cost of other communities, but we sort of give people this negative intention where I don't actually think it's there in a lot of the cases.
Thank you for that. Yes, so true. And to me, it's interesting because what you're saying, it's also, politics is also just at home, like being a parent can be just the way you negotiate with the other parent or other family members or your own children. Like that to me is some of the tools. And I do have to say for our listeners and our viewers, Lindsey has mentioned her book several times with never saying the title. So I will say the title, that has come out is How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You, why it's up to you to do it. So thank you for that. because you mentioned it several times. But yes, and this book is already out, or it's coming out soon.
It's hitting shelves on August 13th. So
Woohoo!
depending on when
Okay,
people are hearing this, it's maybe not yet out or it's
perfect,
out.
perfect, wonderful. Okay, and what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
So, working with college students, I teach an intro to American government class. It's very
Okay,
basic, what's the lay of the land? What's the sort of system that we operate within? And I ask a little pretest on the first day, which is really simple questions. And I found every year there are kids who couldn't get any of them right. And I was like, okay, there's a problem. And then a few years after I started working at my school, I also took on the role of being sort of the liaison for voter registration and voter turnout things. And so we started these things called Duck to the Polls, which is our mascot's a duck. And we would take a bunch of students to go vote. And we don't care how they vote. We just want them to like know where to go do it. And afterwards, we take them for ice cream, do like a little talk about how it was, the end. And every time I would do that, multiple students would get turned away because they were either not registered to vote or they weren't registered to vote in that county and they had no idea. And I thought to myself, like, this is a problem. It really turns people off to the whole like democratic enterprise. They get mad, they get jaded, they get angry, they pull them away. And I don't want that. It doesn't feel good to think we're going to do this thing and then be crestfallen because you can't actually do it. And so I started thinking I was going to write a book about civics curricula across different states. And so I went with 5 research assistants and we interviewed teachers in tons of states throughout the United States. And it became apparent that this was not going to be a book about schools. This was going to have to be a book about homes because there are a lot of really difficult things about teaching civics in schools right now that could change because it's all, it's political decisions. But at this moment, the sort of starting lessons really have to come from parents and grandparents and educators inside a home.
interesting, interesting. That and I mean, like I think like anything, it does start at home, that education. But it's interesting that in your research, that was confirmed that you needed to talk with the parents first. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just there's a few things that make it hard at schools. One is they don't have a lot of curricular time for this. Every standardized test that gets kids into college and every assessment that gets schools more funding doesn't focus on civics. There's not a component of it. And so it's not surprising that it gets squeezed out. When we're looking at learning loss, that's like post the pandemic, people need to know math, they need to know reading. Civics gets pushed aside. And also parents have a little bit of a blame in this. A lot of teachers that we interviewed expressed hesitancy to talk about civics, even in the most like vanilla, basic, straightforward way. Because if a child hears something and goes home and tells a parent, oh, my teacher told me about the 3 branches today, and they said the Congress is the first branch and it's the best. They maybe don't like the president. Then that teacher has to deal with blowback from parents in like a mean Facebook group or calls to the administration or even emails to them. And so their incentives are just a little bit tight right now, where it's not the topic that they necessarily want to wade into, despite the fact that every social studies teacher we talked to was like, yes, we need more of this. No one was like,
Right.
we're doing a good enough job, but everyone was like, it's really hard to do this job well.
Right. Right. And that's I mean, that's sad to me that you're noticing this, because that means that we're getting in the way of our children's education in a way.
Yeah, that was a consistent theme. And in
Yeah.
my own sort of parenting and my own sort of experience in the school systems that I'm in, I see this too. I see a lot of sort of overzealous parent oversight in teaching in ways that would have been impossible 20 years ago, just because you didn't, have access to all the materials they're going to do. They didn't have to email you every day. And so it's easier for parents to do this, and it does happen.
Yeah. And how would you, if you do have a parent that their young child is coming home and maybe, they learn something about politics, or, whether it is from their teacher or in the schoolyard, how do you encourage parents to navigate really maybe those conversations that are important to have about maybe decisive, topics and things like that?
Yeah, so I think something that's important to keep in mind is our kids don't need us to be politics or government experts. They need us to model the behavior of learning more. And so the
Mm,
question that I always like to use with my students, with my daughter, is what have you heard about that? And the reason that I like what have you heard about that is because it releases them from the responsibility of having to defend an opinion or sort of like get the argument right. They don't have to do that. They just have to like set the table and say, here's what I've heard. And I think it's just like a nice entry point because we live in a world where we're all hearing different things. Our algorithms are showing us different pieces of content or little snippets of information. And so in order to get into a conversation, I think it's really important to know what are our starting points? What are we hearing about this versus what do we think or feel or hope? So that's where I like to start.
Yeah. And do you ever encourage families to also maybe investigate as to, like you said, what have you heard, but where did you hear it from? Because I feel sometimes the sources might be biased.
Yeah, I mean, there's not, there's no such thing as an unbiased source. We all sort of have our own biases. And I think that's really important, especially as our kids become teenagers, to be able to see their information and to share our information with them as well. And so something that I say to my students, like when they're dating someone, I say eventually it might be nice to see what their Instagram algorithm looks like. It might be nice to see like the sorts of things they get. And I guarantee it's going to be different. I know like for the boys that I teach, a lot of times they'll get stuff that's like, here's how you do sports betting. That's not in my content. And for the things that I get, it'll be like, here's aging remedies. That's not going to be in their content, just to sort of show them that we're seeing different things are top of mind. And it's important to realize that and then get over that by kind of checking it out and spending some time in the other person's shoes.
Right. But it was also, I guess my question was also to the idea of, fact checking, because sometimes I feel like there might be kind of information that's misconstrued or misinformation or just, I see it, especially with social media. It's like you want to sensationalize everything when there's nothing to sensationalize, but, and so how to help them be kind of critical thinkers about, the information that they are being given.
Yeah, sorry. I like that too. That's sort of like second step is once we figure out what we're seeing is being willing to go do that research. We live in like this wonderful time where we can kind of figure out almost anything in about 20 minutes. Like if you have a phone and the internet, you can get to the bottom of something kind of quick. And doing that journey together or doing it in parallel where you say like, why don't you figure out what you can, I'll figure out what I can, and then we can talk about it and see where the pieces overlap or where they don't quite match up. And it sounds maybe daunting. People don't want to be like research assistants with their kids, but I think it's actually a really neat way to get to know them and for them to know you. And you're learning something at the same time, which is all like modeling this really good behavior versus taking something and sitting with it for 8 seconds and being like, done. It's nice to get into something. And we don't really have a lot of opportunities that demand that of us, but politics and government can certainly be one of them.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Anything else that you would like to share in kind of the research that, you did to write this book, the How to Raise a Citizen? Any research that has, kind of been, divulged or especially for young children, because I feel that a lot of my listeners and viewers are parents of maybe younger children, so not yet college age students, anything about, the importance of teaching kind of on this topic at home from an early age.
Sure. So they're going to hear it whether we like it or not. It sits in that same space as sex, drugs, and
Right.
alcohol. They're going to get something. So it's important that we take it on as an intentional parenting responsibility. But there is another important part of the research that I always like to make really clear, which is when we're raising a citizen, we're not necessarily trying to raise a partisan. And that is, there's really neat research on that where an increasing number of parents over time in surveys say that they want to pass on their political values to children. But the research that looks at children's willingness to adopt the same political party identification of their kids is really mixed, where, you can tell your kids do this, do this, do this, and you got about a 50-50 chance of them listening or saying, actually, I'm going to do something else. And so the goal is never like, make sure you raise a kid who sees the world in the exact same way you do, because they can't, because that's impossible. The world they're interacting with is different than the world we interacted with at their age. But really to find some value in raising someone who understands this operating system. And if they come to a different conclusion than you, that's actually a marker of success. That shows like the richness of your relationship, that you can say, I see this differently. And yet we love each other. We're a family. And so it's not something to really stress. Like I need to make sure I'm raising a little Republican or a little Democrat. Raise someone who understands this system and trust that with that understanding, they'll be able to put that education to the best use possible to figure out how it makes sense for them.
Yes. Yes. And that is so important, because I do know families who some of them don't speak to each other because of politics. And it makes me sad because just, it is, I mean, it is a big part of our existence, but it's not all of it. And if we can't, put that aside, just, like my neighbors I was talking about earlier, we have to be able to put those things aside and learn to hear what they have to say and so forth. Wonderful. Wonderful. And you mentioned you have a child that's how old?
I have one 12-year-old.
12-year-old. And so I presume you have good conversations about politics and what's going on, and especially we're recording this in the summer of 2024, where in the US there's a lot going on right now. And you told me offline there's always a lot going on, but it seems like it's bubbling up more these days. But is she very inquisitive about what's going on, politically and all that?
Yeah, I think she's probably more inquisitive than a lot because she's exposed to a lot. She goes to a lot of sort of like local politics events with me. She hears this stuff. Sometimes she comes to class with me. And something that I'm finding interesting about her as sort of a sounding board is that children do not come into issues knowing what the Republican Party or the Democratic Party expects of them. They come into issues sort of like in their own way of like, what do I think is fair? What do I think is right? What do I think is good? And in talking with her about a bunch of different issues that we confront in New York City where we live, there are pieces where she'll sort of say her piece and she'll say like, oh, you know what? That might be how some Republicans think about this. Or, oh, I think Democrats, because she is starting to piece together how the parties sort of sit on things. But she sees in herself that she doesn't always see it in one way. She has parts of some party that she likes and parts of the other that resonate with her. And I think a lot of kids come to it that way just because they don't have the prism. They just don't have the party prism on their understanding of things yet.
Right, right. And it's true also, like from a developmental stage, she's at a stage where they are so concerned about fairness, about what is right and wrong. So it must be beautiful to have those conversations, especially when that whole, sensitivity to social, etiquette and fairness is developing in her. Wonderful. Wonderful. Anything else you would like to add or to share about some of the, research you discovered as you were writing this book?
I mean, I think what I found is it's never too early and they're always learning. And so a lot of parents think schools are going to take this on. And that is what this second part of the book is it would be great if we could magic like wand it and make schools do this. We can't. And so we have to understand that this is a responsibility. And like we said earlier, parenting is doing better than how our parents did for us. A lot of us were raised in households who had parents who didn't know how to talk about this or didn't know it themselves. But we can change that. We can be the point where we say, you know what, we should learn about this. It's going to happen to us. Let's make sure our kids are equipped and capable of getting through the world in a better way than we are.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And so I always like to kind of wrap up on a more personal topic, if I may, and that you mentioned your daughter is 12. So if you were to go back 13 years ago when you were expecting your child, what wise words would you tell yourself knowing all that you know today?
I think something that I see with little kids now that I didn't see with my own daughter because I was too deep in it is that they just got here. Like we can't expect them to know things or learn things as quick as we can as adults because they just got here. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to correct them. Our task is sort of like nurturing and molding and guiding. But I would give more patience in that enterprise versus thinking, I told you this a few times, you should get it. It's like, oh, you just got here. I understand. It's going to take a while for you to figure this out.
Yeah. Oh, so true. I love that, Lindsey, because it's true. I always say, they're brand new to this planet. Like we can't expect them to know. So wonderful. Any parting words that you would like to leave our listeners and viewers with today?
I want to thank your listeners and viewers for being willing to get on this topic. I know a lot of people want to tune out when they hear politics because it feels stressful or adrenaline responses come up. But I think we owe it to ourselves and to our kids to take the tone down. And part of that is being willing to learn more. So thank you for having me. And thank you for putting out this sort of information.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. It's been lovely. Thank you.